The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday, smudged and wrinkled from its long journey across 3 states, but the words remained clear enough to shatter Grace Johnson's world. Wedding OFF stop, do not come stop. Yet here she was, stepping off the stage coach into the scorching Arizona sun of 1878. Her stomach knotted with determination and the last of her savings spent on the one-way ticket to Copper Canyon. Grace clutched her worn leather valise and surveyed the dusty main street. The town was smaller than she'd imagined from Victor's letters, one main thoroughfare lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon with piano music drifting through batwing doors, and a general store with rocking chairs occupied by old men watching newcomers with suspicious eyes. "Miss, you need help with those bags." A freckle-faced boy of about 12 approached her, eyeing her city clothes with curiosity. "Thank you, but I can manage." She smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirt. "Could you direct me to the Callaway ranch? I'm expected there." The boy's eyes widened. "The Callaway place? That's 10 miles out. Nobody's expected out there except—" He stopped abruptly. "You ain't the mail-order bride, are you?" Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am Victor Calloway's fiancée, yes." The boy shuffled his feet nervously. "Madam, you might want to speak with Sheriff Tanner first. There's been some developments." A chill ran through Grace despite the heat. "What developments?" "Victor Calloway's dead, madam. Shot 3 weeks back in a dispute with the Harrington outfit. His brother Vaughn's running the ranch now." The world seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. Her vision narrowed to pinpricks of light as she reached blindly for something to steady herself. A strong arm caught her before she could collapse into the dirt. "Whoa there. I got you." The voice was deep, rough-edged like a stone worn smooth by a river. Grace looked up into eyes the color of a winter sky, set in a sun-browned face beneath a sweat-stained Stetson. "You all right, madam?" I don't know." Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Victor's dead." The stranger's expression shifted from concern to recognition. His jaw tightened visibly. "You're Grace Johnson." "Yes." "And you are." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. "Vaughn Callaway. Victor was my brother." Grace felt as though she'd been struck. This was Victor's younger brother, the wild one, the troublemaker Victor had mentioned only in passing. The one who'd left for 5 years to make his fortune in the silver mines before returning last Christmas. "I sent you a telegram," Vaughn said, his voice low. "Told you not to come." "That's all it said," Grace replied, finding her voice and her anger simultaneously. "Wedding off. Do not come." No explanation, no condolences, nothing about Victor's death. The word caught in her throat. Vaughn replaced his hat. "The telegraph office charges by the word. How considerate of you to be economical while informing me my fiancé was dead." Grace straightened her shoulders. "I'll need transport back to the station in Phoenix. Stage doesn't come back through for a week." Vaughn looked uncomfortable. "Look, Miss Johnson, it's Grace." "Grace." He said her name like he was testing the feel of it on his tongue. "You can stay at the ranch until the next stage." It's what Victor would have wanted. "And what do you want, Mr. Callaway?" His eyes met hers directly. "I want to honor my brother's last wishes. He was worried about you, about what would happen if something happened to him." "What do you mean?" Vaughn glanced around the busy street. "Not here. Let me get your bags. We can talk on the ride out." Against her better judgment, Grace found herself being helped into a wagon beside the brother of the man she'd come to marry. They traveled in silence for several miles, the wagon bouncing over ruts in the rough trail as they left town behind. Mountains rose purple in the distance, and the land around them stretched vast and open, nothing like the crowded streets of Philadelphia. "Victor wrote that your parents died last year," Vaughn finally said. "Said you were working as a seamstress to support yourself." Grace nodded stiffly. That's correct. Though I don't see how. And you were living with your aunt. But she passed this spring. You seem to know a great deal about me. Victor talked about you. A lot. Vaughn kept his eyes on the trail. When he was dying, he made me promise to take care of you. Grace felt a fresh wave of grief. I don't understand. He wanted me to marry you. The words hung in the air between them. Grace stared at his profile in shock. That's preposterous. I told him the same thing. Vaughn's hands tightened on the reins. But he was worried you'd have nowhere to go, no means to support yourself. Said you'd spent your last savings on the trip out here. Grace looked away, humiliated that this stranger knew how desperate her situation was. I appreciate the concern, but I'll manage. Like you've been managing? Working 18-hour days at a dress shop and still barely affording rent. Vaughn's bluntness stung. Victor said you were stubborn. And I suppose you're the reasonable one? She snapped back. The brother who disappeared for years while Victor built the ranch alone? His jaw tightened. You don't know anything about why I left. I know Victor never mentioned you until last Christmas when you suddenly returned. She crossed her arms. And now you've inherited everything he worked for. Vaughn reined the horses to a halt so suddenly that Grace had to brace herself against the seat. He turned to her, eyes flashing with anger. I didn't want any of this, he said, voice low and intense. I told Victor to sell the ranch years ago, after our parents died. The Harringtons have been trying to run us off this land since before we were born. I told him it wasn't worth dying over. But he stayed. He stayed because he wanted to build something for you. A home. Vaughn shook the reins and the horses moved forward again. I came back because he wrote that he was in trouble. The Harringtons had dammed up the creek that runs through our property. Without water, the cattle would die, Grace finished. She remembered Victor's last letter, his concerns about the neighbors' hostility, though he'd minimized it to avoid worrying her. Vaughn nodded. I came back to help him fight. Too late, as it turns out. They crested a rise, and Grace saw the ranch spread before them, a modest house with a wide porch, a barn, corrals, and beyond them, green pastures where cattle grazed. In the distance, a ribbon of trees marked the creek Victor had written about. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's also mortgaged to the hilt. Victor took loans to build the house for you. If we lose the water rights case against Harrington next month, the bank will foreclose. Vaughn glanced at her. That's why I sent the telegram. There's no future here for you now. Grace sat in silence as they approached the house. It wasn't grand by Philadelphia standards, but she could see Victor's care in every detail, the covered porch where they could have sat on summer evenings, the flower boxes beneath windows that caught the western light. So you're suggesting we marry to fulfill your brother's dying wish? She finally asked. I'm suggesting you'll still have the wedding you came for, if you'll let me stand in Victor's place. Vaughn didn't look at her as he said it. It would be a marriage in name only. You'd have a home and security. I'd have a better chance of keeping the ranch. How does my presence help with that? The judge hearing our water rights case is Joshua Prentice. He's old-fashioned, believes in family farms over big cattle operations like Harrington's. A married man with a wife, setting down roots that looks better to him than a bachelor who might sell out. So I'd be nothing more than a prop in your legal strategy. Grace felt a surge of indignation. You'd be honoring Victor's last wish. Vaughn pulled the wagon to a stop before the house. And getting what you came for, a home, security, a fresh start. Everything except love, Grace said quietly. Vaughn's expression softened slightly. Victor loved you enough for both of us. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and calloused around her waist. For just a moment, she was close enough to catch his scent: leather, horses, and something like pine. Then he stepped back, maintaining a proper distance. "Mrs. Hernandez keeps house for us," he said, gesturing toward the door where an older Mexican woman had appeared. "She'll show you to Victor's room, your room now. Take today to rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to make decisions." Grace nodded, suddenly exhausted from travel and grief. Mrs. Hernandez led her inside, chattering in a mix of English and Spanish about how they'd been expecting her, how sorry they were about Mr. Victor, how the room was all ready with fresh linens. The bedroom was simply furnished but comfortable, a four-poster bed with a handmade quilt, a pine dresser with a mirror, a rocking chair by the window. On the bedside table sat a framed photograph of Victor, his serious expression so familiar it made her heart ache. "Did you know him well?" Grace asked Mrs. Hernandez, picking up the photograph. "Mr. Victor?" "See, since he was a boy." The housekeeper's eyes softened. "A good man, quiet, steady. Not like Mr. Vaughn, that one, he has fire in his blood. But both good men in different ways." After Mrs. Hernandez left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph in her lap. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd only known through letters. Now he was gone, and his brother, a stranger with winter blue eyes, was offering her the wedding she had expected, but with himself as the groom. It was madness. Yet as she looked around the room Victor had prepared for her, she couldn't deny the appeal of staying. What waited for her back in Philadelphia? Another seamstress position if she was lucky? A room in a boarding house filled with other women living on the edge of respectability and poverty? Grace set the photograph down and began to unpack her meager belongings. She would take Vaughn's advice and wait until tomorrow to decide. Tonight, she would mourn the man she had come to marry and the dreams that had died with him. The next morning, Grace woke to sunlight streaming through curtains she didn't recognize. For a moment, disorientation gripped her until memory returned: Victor's death, Vaughn's proposal, the ranch that might soon be lost. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a navy cotton with white piping that had traveled better than expected, and made her way to the kitchen where Mrs. Hernandez was frying potatoes and eggs. "Buenos dias, señorita. Mr. Vaughn is already out checking the north pasture. Said to tell you he'll be back for midday meal." Grace accepted a cup of coffee. "Could you tell me more about the situation with the Harringtons? The water rights issue." Mrs. Hernandez clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Bad business. They dam the creek on their property, say it's their water. But for 50 years that creek watered this land. Without it—" She made a withering gesture with her hand. "And the court case is next month? See, Judge Prentice comes through on the circuit. They say he is fair, but—" She shrugged expressively. After breakfast, Grace asked directions to Victor's grave. She found it on a small rise behind the house, marked with a wooden cross. Someone had planted wildflowers around it. She knelt in the dry grass, running her fingers over his name carved in the wood. "I don't know what to do, Victor," she whispered. "Is this truly what you would have wanted for me? For Vaughn?" A horse's whinny interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Vaughn dismounting nearby, his expression unreadable as he approached. He removed his hat as he neared the grave. "I come out here most mornings," he said. "Talk to him. Probably sounds foolish." "No," Grace replied. "It sounds like you miss him." Vaughn nodded, his gaze fixed on the cross. "We didn't always see eye to eye, but he was a good man. Better than me in most ways. Mrs. Hernandez told me a little about the water rights issue." "Did she mention that Harrington had offered to buy our land for years? That the dam went up right after Victor turned down his last offer?" Vaughn's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Victor was shot riding back from town. Harrington claims it was a hunting accident." "You don't believe that?" "I know Harrington wants this land, and Victor was in his way." He met her eyes. "Now I'm in his way." And if we lose the water, he'll get what he wants anyway. Hence your proposal. Vaughn looked uncomfortable. It's not just about the court case. Victor truly was worried about your future. As are you, apparently. Grace stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. I've been thinking about your offer. I have conditions. Something like surprise flashed across his face. Name them. First, we present this as a real marriage to the outside world. No one knows it's an arrangement except us. He nodded. Agreed. Second, if we win the water rights case, the ranch becomes jointly owned between us. I won't be dependent on your charity. Vaughn considered this, then nodded again. Fair enough. Third, after a year, if either of us wishes to end the arrangement, we'll find a quiet, amicable way to do so. And if we lose the case and the ranch? He asked. Grace lifted her chin. Then we'll face that together as well. You have a deal, Miss Johnson. He extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. His palm was warm and rough against hers. When would this wedding take place? She asked, withdrawing her hand. The circuit preacher comes through on Sunday. That's 4 days from now. He studied her face. Is that too soon? Grace thought of the white dress packed carefully in her trunk, made by her own hands during long evenings after the shop closed. No, Sunday will do. As they walked back to the house together, Grace wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or securing her future. Either way, she was gambling everything on a man she barely knew, a man who might be protecting his brother's legacy, or might have other motives entirely. The next 4 days passed in a flurry of activity. Mrs. Hernandez embraced the wedding preparations with enthusiasm, cleaning the house from top to bottom and planning a feast. Word spread quickly through the surrounding homesteads, and Grace found herself receiving visitors, neighboring women curious about the Eastern bride who had arrived despite her fiancé's death, now preparing to marry his brother. It's what Victor wanted, became her practiced response to their barely concealed curiosity. Vaughn is honoring his brother's wishes. Meanwhile, Vaughn spent most days working the ranch, returning dusty and tired each evening. They shared supper at opposite ends of the table, making awkward conversation about the ranch, the weather, the upcoming wedding. He was unfailingly polite but distant, as though already establishing the boundaries of their arrangement. On the third evening, Grace was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Vaughn returned early from checking fence lines. He hesitated at the bottom step, then came up and sat in the rocking chair beside her. My mother used to say this was the best view in Arizona Territory, he said, nodding toward the mountains turning purple in the fading light. It's beautiful, Grace agreed. Different from Philadelphia. Victor said you grew up in the city. Do you miss it? Grace considered the question. I miss certain things, libraries, concerts, the bustle of people. But there was never enough space to breathe. Plenty of space here, Vaughn said. Sometimes too much. A comfortable silence fell between them. Grace studied his profile in the fading light. There was a resemblance to Victor in the line of his jaw, the shape of his nose, but where Victor's features had been arranged in perpetual seriousness, Vaughn's held a hint of something wilder, less contained. Why did you really leave 5 years ago? She asked suddenly. Vaughn's rocking chair stilled. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Our father died in a dispute with Harrington's father, he finally said. Shot in the back while checking cattle near the property line. Victor wanted to take it to the law, do things properly. I wanted to settle it the old way. With violence. With justice, he corrected. But Victor stopped me. We fought. He said I'd bring more trouble on the family, that our mother couldn't bear to lose another man to this feud. So I left. To protect your family. Vaughn looked at her sharply. I left because I was young and angry and couldn't see another way. And you came back because... Because Victor wrote that he needed me. Because I was tired of running from who I am and where I belong. He ran a hand through his hair. Because 5 years is long enough to learn that sometimes Victor was right. Grace nodded, understanding better now the complicated relationship between the brothers. Thank you for telling me. Vaughn stood, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of their conversation. I should check on the horses before dark. As he reached the steps, Grace called after him. Vaughn? I think Victor would be proud of what you're doing now. He paused without turning. I hope so. Then he continued to the barn, his shoulders set in a rigid line. On Sunday morning, Grace stood before the bedroom mirror in her wedding dress cream-colored cotton with lace she'd salvaged from her mother's wedding gown. It was simple but elegant, suited to a ranch wedding rather than the grand church ceremony she'd once envisioned. Mrs. Hernandez helped with her hair, weaving wildflowers through the braided crown while chattering about good omens and blessings. When she finished, she stepped back with tears in her eyes. You look beautiful, señorita. Like an angel. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Hernandez opened it to reveal a young cowhand named Miguel, one of the ranch workers. Riders coming, he said breathlessly. Harrington men. 6 of them. Grace's stomach dropped. Where's Vaughn? Out front. Told me to tell you to stay inside. Grace gathered her skirts. Take me to him. Despite Mrs. Hernandez's protests, Grace followed Miguel through the house and onto the porch. Vaughn stood in the yard, rifle in hand, as a group of riders approached. She recognized Claude Harrington from Victor's descriptions, a heavy-set man with a gray beard and cold eyes leading the others. Callaway, Harrington called as they stopped their horses. Heard you were having a wedding today. Thought we'd pay our respects. You're not welcome here, Harrington, Vaughn replied, his voice steady. Harrington's gaze shifted to Grace on the porch. This must be the bride. Pretty thing. He tipped his hat mockingly. Madam, my condolences on your loss. And congratulations on finding a replacement so quickly. Grace felt anger rise in her chest. She started down the steps, ignoring Vaughn's warning glance. Mr. Harrington, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. I understand you've had your eye on this property for some time. Harrington looked surprised at her directness. It's good grazing land. Goes better with my operation than this little hobby ranch. Yet 2 men have died refusing to sell it to you. Grace moved to stand beside Vaughn. That suggests it's worth more than you've offered. A ripple of unease went through Harrington's men. The rancher's face darkened. Victor Calloway died in a hunting accident, madam. You'd do well to remember that. And my husband's father? Vaughn asked, his voice dangerous. Grace felt a jolt at his use of the word husband before their vows, but she kept her expression neutral. Ancient history, Harrington dismissed. Look, I came to make you one final offer before the water rights hearing. $10,000 for the whole spread. That's generous. This land isn't for sale, Grace replied before Vaughn could speak. Now, if you'll excuse us, we're expecting a preacher shortly. Harrington's eyes narrowed. You think getting married will sway old Prentice? Maybe, maybe not. But without water, your cattle will be dead before winter. He gathered his reins. Think about my offer, Callaway. It expires after the hearing. As they rode away, Vaughn turned to Grace with a mixture of anger and admiration. You shouldn't have confronted him like that. Would you have preferred I cower inside? She raised an eyebrow. If I'm to be your wife, even in name only, I won't hide when there's trouble. A muscle worked in Vaughn's jaw. Harrington's dangerous. So are we. Grace surprised herself with her boldness. Together. Something shifted in Vaughn's expression, a warming that reached his eyes. Yes, madam. I believe we are. The wedding was simple but beautiful. The circuit preacher arrived an hour later, and neighbors gathered in the front yard, where Mrs. Hernandez had arranged benches beneath a cottonwood tree. As Grace walked toward Vaughn, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers, she felt strangely calm. This wasn't the wedding she had expected, but perhaps it was the one she needed. Vaughn had cleaned up impressively, wearing a black suit that must have been Victor's. It fit a bit tight across the shoulders. His eyes never left her face as she approached, and when he took her hands in his, she felt a steadiness in his grip that reassured her. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, and Grace found herself listening to the familiar words with new understanding. Marriage wasn't just about love, it was about partnership, protection, building something lasting together. When Vaughn slid a simple gold band onto her finger, Victor's mother's ring, Mrs. Hernandez had told her. His hand trembled slightly. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, his voice low but firm. The celebration afterward was livelier than Grace had anticipated. Neighbors brought food and drink, a fiddle player started up tunes, and lanterns were strung as dusk approached. Grace found herself passed from one dance partner to another as the local women pulled her aside to offer advice and congratulations. "Never thought I'd see Vaughn Callaway settled," one older woman confided. "That boy was wilder than a March hare before he left. Seems steadier now, though. You must be a good influence." As the evening wore on, Grace noticed Vaughn keeping a careful distance, making sure they were rarely alone together. It was thoughtful. She supposed he was establishing the boundaries of their arrangement, but somehow disappointing as well. When the guests finally departed and Mrs. Hernandez retired to her small cabin behind the main house, Grace found herself alone with her new husband for the first time. They stood awkwardly in the parlor, the sounds of crickets filtering through open windows. "I've moved my things to the small bedroom off the kitchen," Vaughn said finally. "You'll have privacy in the main bedroom." "Thank you." Grace twisted her new ring nervously. "Vaughn, I want to thank you for today. For all of this." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's what Victor would have wanted." "Is that the only reason you're doing this?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Vaughn looked away. "Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow's a working day." He turned to leave, but Grace caught his arm. "We're married now, at least in name. I think I deserve more than half-truths." Vaughn stood very still, her hand on his sleeve. "What do you want to know?" "Why you really offered to marry me. And don't say it's just for the water rights case or Victor's wishes." He met her eyes then, his gaze intense. "I offered because when I saw you standing in the street that day, looking lost but determined, I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. Someone who'd traveled a long way only to find everything changed." His voice softened. "And because when Victor described you in his letters, I envied him. I wanted to know the woman who could make my serious brother sound so alive." Grace felt her breath catch. "You don't even know me." "I'm starting to." He gently removed her hand from his sleeve. "But this isn't what you signed up for, Grace. You came to marry Victor, a good, steady man who would have given you a simple, honest life. And instead I got you." She smiled slightly. "A complicated man with a contested ranch and a feud with the neighbors." A hint of an answering smile touched his lips. "Exactly. What if I told you I'm finding I prefer complicated?" She took a step closer. Vaughn's expression grew serious. "I'd say we have a month until the water rights hearing. Let's focus on saving the ranch first. Then we can figure out whatever this is." He was right, Grace knew. They were still virtually strangers, bound by necessity and circumstance. Yet as she watched him walk away, she couldn't help feeling that their arrangement was already becoming something neither of them had planned. The next few weeks established a rhythm to their unusual marriage. During the day, Grace learned the workings of the ranch, helping Mrs. Hernandez with household management, studying the account books, even learning to ride from Miguel so she could visit the further pastures. Vaughn worked from dawn till dusk, preparing for both the hearing and the coming winter. At night, they would share supper and talk tentatively at first, then with growing ease. Grace told him about her life in Philadelphia, the struggle after her parents' deaths, her dreams of adventure that had led her to answer Victor's advertisement for a bride. Vaughn shared stories of growing up on the ranch, his time in the silver mines, the hard lessons he'd learned during his years away. Gradually, the awkwardness between them faded, replaced by a companionable understanding and, increasingly, moments of unexpected connection. Grace would catch Vaughn watching her with an expression that made her heart quicken. He would find reasons to be near her, showing her how to check the henhouse for eggs, teaching her to shoot his revolver just in case, reading aloud from one of the few books in the house as she mended clothes in the evening. They never spoke of these moments, maintaining the fiction that theirs was a marriage of convenience only. But Grace felt something shifting between them, a tension building that neither acknowledged. 2 weeks before the hearing, Grace rode out to find Vaughn checking cattle in the north pasture. The creek that should have watered this section of the ranch was nearly dry, just a trickle where there should have been a steady flow. The cattle looked thin, clustered around what little water remained. "It's worse than I thought," Grace said as she dismounted beside him. Vaughn nodded grimly. "We'll have to move them closer to the house, use the well water. It won't be enough for long." "What are our chances at the hearing?" "Honestly, without proof that Harrington deliberately dammed the creek to force us out, it's his word against ours. And he has more friends in the territory than we do." Grace surveyed the struggling herd. "These cattle represent everything Victor worked for, everything you came back to protect, and everything you left Philadelphia to be part of," Vaughn added quietly. Their eyes met, and Grace felt the now familiar warmth that came with these moments of understanding. "We need evidence," she said. "Something to show the judge that the damming wasn't just for Harrington's legitimate use. I've ridden up to the dam. It's on his property, guarded day and night." Vaughn shook his head. "No way to get close enough to see how it's constructed." An idea began forming in Grace's mind. What if we approached from a different angle? The wives. Vaughn looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Harrington was at our wedding. She seemed sympathetic. And their daughter-in-law, Martha, has invited me to tea twice now. You think they'd betray Harrington?" "I think women often know more than men give them credit for." Grace straightened in her saddle. "Let me accept Martha's invitation. See what I can learn." Vaughn considered her for a long moment. "It could be dangerous if Harrington suspects you're gathering information." "More dangerous than losing everything?" She held his gaze. "Trust me, Vaughn. I can do this." After a moment, he nodded. "Be careful." 2 days later, Grace sat in the Harringtons' impressive parlor, sipping tea with Martha Harrington and her mother-in-law. The house was grand by territorial standards, 2 stories with imported furniture and real glass windows. Mrs. Harrington Sr. was quietly elegant, while Martha was friendly but nervous, her eyes darting occasionally toward the door. "Such a lovely home," Grace commented. "How long have the Harringtons been in the territory?" "Claude's father established the ranch in 47. The elder Mrs. Harrington replied. "Built it from nothing into the largest spread in the county. Through hard work and determination, I'm sure," Grace said diplomatically. Martha gave a small, unexpected snort. "And other methods." Her mother-in-law shot her a warning glance. "Martha, perhaps you could show Grace the garden while I check on lunch." When they were alone among the carefully tended roses, Martha's posture relaxed. "I apologize for my comment. It's just, there are things about this family that trouble me." "Such as?" Grace prompted gently. Martha glanced toward the house. "My husband Thomas doesn't tell me everything. but I overheard him arguing with his father about the dam. She lowered her voice. Thomas said it wasn't right, that they were going too far. That what happened to Victor Calloway would come back on them. Grace's heart quickened. What exactly did he say about Victor? That it wasn't supposed to go that far. That Claude had only meant to scare him. Martha's eyes filled with tears. I think your brother-in-law was murdered, Mrs. Callaway, and I think my father-in-law was behind it. Grace reached for Martha's hand. Do you have any proof? Nothing I could take to a judge. But she hesitated. Thomas keeps records of everything. In his study there's a ledger. It has the expenses for building the dam. The design isn't just to provide water for our cattle. It's specifically engineered to cut off your creek completely. If we had that ledger, Martha shook her head frantically. I can't steal from my husband. He'd know it was me. Could you copy certain pages? Just enough to show the intent. Martha bit her lip, considering. Maybe. Thomas is riding out to the line cabins tomorrow. He'll be gone all day. You'd be helping bring justice for Victor, Grace said softly, and possibly saving our ranch. Before Martha could respond, Mrs. Harrington called them back for lunch. The rest of the visit passed in polite conversation, but when Grace left, Martha pressed a note into her hand. Willow Creek Bridge. Tomorrow. Noon. That night, Grace told Vaughn everything. They sat at the kitchen table, heads bent close together as she recounted Martha's revelations. It could be a trap, Vaughn said, his brow furrowed with concern. I don't think so. Martha seemed genuinely troubled. Grace touched his hand. This could be the evidence we need. Vaughn turned his palm up to grasp her fingers. I'm coming with you. No. If Harrington suspects anything, they'll be watching you. I'll go alone. Absolutely not. His grip tightened. I won't risk losing you too. The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither had acknowledged. Grace felt her pulse quicken. You won't lose me, she promised softly. Vaughn's eyes searched hers. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. Be careful tomorrow. The simple gesture left Grace breathless. That night, lying alone in the bedroom that should have been hers and Victor's, she wondered when exactly her feelings for Vaughn had transformed from wary partnership to something much more complicated and much more real. The next day, Grace rode to Willow Creek Bridge with nerves strung tight as fiddle strings. The meeting spot was halfway between the two ranches, visible from the road but secluded enough for privacy. She arrived early, scanning the area for any sign of a trap. At precisely noon, Martha appeared on horseback, riding side saddle and looking as nervous as Grace felt. She dismounted quickly, glancing over her shoulder. I can only stay a minute, she said, reaching into her saddlebag. Thomas's study was locked, but I found these in the barn office. She handed Grace several folded papers. It's correspondence with the engineer who designed the dam. It specifically mentions diverting all water from the Callaway property. Grace unfolded the papers, scanning them quickly. The evidence was clear. The dam had been deliberately designed to cut off their water completely, not just to create a reservoir for Harrington's use as he had claimed. Martha, thank you. This could save our ranch. There's more. Martha lowered her voice. I overheard Claude and Thomas arguing this morning. Claude wants to send men to your property before the hearing to cause an accident. They know your evidence could ruin them. Grace felt cold fear spread through her. What kind of accident? I don't know exactly, but Claude mentioned the house. Martha glanced nervously down the road. I have to go. Be careful, Grace. These men. She shook her head. They're not who I thought I was marrying into. After Martha rode away, Grace galloped back to the ranch, the precious papers secure inside her bodice. She found Vaughn in the barn repairing tack. "Vaughn!" She thrust the papers toward him. Martha came through. "This proves everything." He read quickly, his expression darkening. "This is exactly what we needed." Then he looked up sharply. "Did anyone see you meeting her?" Grace hesitated. "I don't think so. But Martha warned me that Harrington is planning something, some kind of accident at the house before the hearing." Vaughn's face hardened. "Get your things. We're leaving." "Leaving? But the ranch? We'll take these papers straight to Judge Prentice in town. He's already arrived for the circuit court session." Vaughn was already moving toward the house. "I'm not risking your safety by staying here when Harrington might attack tonight." Within an hour, they had packed essential items and explained the situation to Mrs. Hernandez, who agreed to stay with her son's family in town. Miguel and the other hands would watch the cattle but sleep in the bunkhouse rather than the main house. As they rode toward town, Grace noticed Vaughn constantly scanning the horizon, his rifle across his saddle. "You're truly worried," she observed. "Harrington's backed into a corner now. That makes him dangerous." He looked at her, his expression grim. "I lost Victor to this feud. I won't lose you too. You keep saying that." Grace guided her horse closer to his. "As if I matter to you beyond our arrangement." Vaughn was silent for a long moment. "You know that's true." "Do I?" She held his gaze. "You've never actually said it." He reined his horse to a stop, forcing Grace to halt beside him. The setting sun cast long shadows across the trail as he turned to face her fully. "I didn't plan this, Grace. When I suggested this marriage, it was for Victor's sake and for the ranch." His voice was low, intense. "But these past weeks, watching you fight for our home, seeing your courage," he shook his head. "You're nothing like I expected. You're better." Grace's heart thundered in her chest. "And what exactly are you saying, Vaughn Callaway?" "I'm saying I think I'm falling in love with my wife." The words came out rough, almost reluctant. "And it terrifies me because I'm not the man you came to marry. I'm not steady like Victor. I'm not safe." Grace reached across the space between their horses to touch his face. "I didn't come west looking for safety. I came looking for a future, for a place to belong." Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. "I think I've found both with you." Vaughn captured her hand, pressing it against his cheek. "When this is over, when the ranch is secure, I want to court you properly. The way you deserve. If you'll let me." Grace smiled, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. "I'd like that very much." Their moment was interrupted by the distant sound of gunshots. They both turned toward the sound coming from the direction of their ranch. "The house," Vaughn said grimly. Harrington didn't waste any time. They rode hard back toward the ranch, arriving to find flames licking up the side of the house. Miguel and the other hands were fighting the fire with buckets from the well, while shots were still being exchanged with riders retreating across the pasture. "They set fire to the north side," Miguel called when he saw them. "We caught them in the act." Vaughn leaped from his horse, rushing to join the bucket line. Grace followed, hitching up her skirts to pump water from the well. For an hour they fought the blaze, finally bringing it under control as the sun disappeared completely. The north bedroom, Victor's room, now Grace's, was destroyed, but the rest of the house was saved. As they stood surveying the damage in the dark, soot-streaked and exhausted, Vaughn put his arm around Grace's shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Victor built this house for you, and now, the house isn't what matters." She leaned against him. "We're safe. We have the evidence. And we still have each other." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Let's get to town. Tonight we stay at the hotel. Tomorrow we see the judge." The next morning, they presented their evidence to Judge Prentice in his temporary chambers at the courthouse. The elderly judge reviewed the papers with a deepening frown. "This is disturbing, Mr. Callaway. Very disturbing indeed." He looked up at them over his spectacles. "You realize these documents alone don't prove Mr. Harrington was behind the attack on your property last night, or your brother's death?" "No, sir," Vaughn agreed. "But they do prove he deliberately diverted our water with malicious intent. And given last night's events." "Yes, well," the judge shuffled the papers. "I'm inclined to rule in your favor on the water rights issue. The creek should be restored to its natural flow immediately." He fixed them with a stern look. "As for the more serious allegations, that would require a criminal investigation." "Are you prepared for what that might entail?" Vaughn looked at Grace, who nodded. "We are, Your Honor." "Very well." The judge sighed. "I'll issue my ruling on the water rights tomorrow, and I'll speak to the territorial marshal about investigating these other matters." As they left the courthouse, Grace squeezed Vaughn's hand. "It's a start." "It's more than that," he replied. "It's justice for Victor." That evening, as they sat in the hotel restaurant celebrating their victory with a proper dinner, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Sheriff Tanner entered, followed by two deputies escorting a handcuffed Claude Harrington. The sheriff approached their table. "Mr. and Mrs. Callaway, thought you'd want to know Thomas Harrington came to me this afternoon with a full confession about his father's role in Victor's death. Says it's been eating at him for weeks." Grace thought of Martha's troubled face. "His wife must have convinced him to come forward." The sheriff nodded. "Said something similar himself. Claimed his wife helped him find his conscience." He tipped his hat. "Anyway, thought you'd want to know. Justice is slow sometimes, but it usually finds a way." After the sheriff left, Vaughn reached across the table for Grace's hand. "It's over," he said softly. "The water, the ranch, Victor, it's all settled now." "Not quite everything," Grace replied, squeezing his fingers. "We still have to decide what happens with us." Vaughn's eyes were warm as they met hers. "I meant what I said yesterday. I want to court you properly. Start fresh." "We're already married," Grace reminded him with a smile. "In name, yes, but I want more than that." He brought her hand to his lips. "I want a real marriage, Grace, if you'll have me." "I came west expecting a wedding," Grace said softly. "Instead I found a home, justice for Victor, and a man I never expected to love." She leaned across the table. "You once told me I'd still have my wedding if I'd let you stand in Victor's place. Now I'm telling you I don't want you standing in anyone's place. I want you, Vaughn Callaway, exactly as you are." He stood, pulling her to her feet and into his arms, heedless of the other diners. "Is that a yes?" he murmured against her hair. Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." 1 year later, Grace stood on the porch of the rebuilt ranch house, watching Vaughn return from checking the now flowing creek. The water rights victory had saved the ranch, and Claude Harrington's conviction for Victor's murder had ended the feud that had claimed 2 generations of men. Martha and Thomas Harrington had sold their portion of the Harrington Ranch and moved east to start fresh. The remaining Harrington land was now managed by the elder Mrs. Harrington, who had proven to be a fair and peaceful neighbor. As Vaughn dismounted and walked toward her, Grace placed a hand on her slightly rounded belly. They had married again 6 months after the first ceremony, this time for love rather than necessity. Now they were expecting their first child in the spring. "How are my 2 favorite people?" Vaughn asked, climbing the steps to kiss her. "Hungry," Grace replied with a smile. "Both of us." He laughed, the sound free and easy in a way it hadn't been when they first met. "Well, we can't have that." As they walked inside together, Grace paused to look back at the land stretching around them, the land Victor had loved and died for, the land that was now truly their home. "Do you ever wonder what Victor would think?" she asked softly. "About us? About everything that's happened?" Vaughn's arm tightened around her waist. "I think he'd be happy. This was all he ever wanted, the ranch secure. The feud ended." He kissed her temple. "And you happy?" "I am happy." Grace leaned into his embrace. "Happier than I ever imagined possible when I stepped off that stagecoach." "You came expecting a wedding," Vaughn reminded her with a smile. "And I got so much more." She turned in his arms to face him. "I got a home. I got justice. I got you." She brushed her lips against his. "I got everything I never knew I needed." Vaughn deepened the kiss, his hands gentle on her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Callaway," he whispered against her lips. "Welcome home."